Now from here, I've also pre-drilled these pickups. These are P90 pickups, they're direct mount. If you look on the direct mount, basically means they go straight into the timber with the screws on the bottom. Now if you look on the underside of the pickup, you'll see an N here for the neck. So I'm going to thread that one through first. Just through the hole in the side of the neck pickup cavity. That will feed through there like so. And make sure the wire is at the corner closest to the electronics cavity. As I said, I've already put these holes in place. So as I said, they're direct mount pickups, which means they are height adjustable, but only through the 2 screws in the middle here. We'll finalise our pickup height when we're doing the final setup. And just poke this red wire through the cavity, through the side of the cavity in the corner here. There's a hole there through the electronics cavity. And lastly, we'll fit our bridge pickup. So same thing again, straight through. Make sure the corner closest to the hole. It's been a little bit recarpentered, so I may just need to pull that through. Installation of these is really the same as we've done all other hardware. So I've used my ground down precision screwdriver to mark the holes. I've drilled down to a depth of about 2/3 of the screw using a drill bit, about 2/3 of the width, and marked my holes and then put the pickups in place. And that's really it for hardware installation now. So from here, we'll start installing our electronics. First thing, we've got 2 potentiometers, input jack, capacitor, and a 3-way box style pickup selector. So if we're visualizing the guitar, we've got 2 pickups in this case. Now pickup is known as a transducer, and what a transducer does is measure change in something. So in the case of a pickup, we've got a magnet surrounded by copper wire, and that creates an electromagnetic field. When we vibrate a guitar string, which is magnetic, over the top of that field, it creates an AC current, or an alternating current, which can be mapped to sound. And essentially, that current travels along the hot wire, which is a shielded wire on the pickup. And if we plugged in the active wire to the active lug on our input jack, and the ground wire from our pickup to the ground wire lug on our input jack, we'd essentially have sound. What the pickup selector does is allow us to pick the right, either the neck, bridge, or a combination of the 2 pickups. A volume selector is essentially regulating the amount of voltage that passes through it. So if we turn this down, it sends a lot of that voltage to ground. If we turn it right up, none of it's going to ground. In the case of a tone pot, this works slightly differently. We're directing that voltage through this capacitor, which is a filter. And this filter allows high frequencies to pass through quite easily, but doesn't allow low frequencies to pass through. And when this is set up, it's set to ground, which means those high frequencies that pass through go to ground. And that's how we adjust tone. Okay, so moving right along, when it comes to soldering, there's a few basic things we're going to need. For one, we're going to need a soldering iron. Secondly, we're going to need some solder. Third, and what I recommend having on hand, is just a damp rag, a damp sponge like this. And as you get build up on the tip of your soldering iron, just clean it off. Now when it comes to soldering, unless you've been shown properly, a lot of people tend to treat soldering like they're gluing something together, and soldering's a little different to that. Soldering is more about transferring heat. So what I've got is a very hot iron. Well, it's not hot at the moment, obviously, but when it's turned on, I've got a very hot iron, and the solder likes to stick to that. I tin the point of this iron, which basically means I'm giving it a coating of solder, and the solder is drawn to the heat. So if you've ever soldered before and had trouble, if you bring that soldering iron straight onto the component and try and press solder onto that straight away, what you'll find is the solder doesn't want to come off the iron, because the corresponding, or the component we're soldering to, is still cold. So you need to preheat that for a few seconds first. And essentially that's what we're doing. We're transferring heat. Once that next component's hot enough, we hold the solder over it and keep our tip against it, and it will just allow us to melt a little bit of that solder and complete that connection. Now the other thing that's important is tinning. So I've already talked about tinning the tip of your iron. You also need to tin the lugs you're going to be connecting to, which means just putting a very light coating of solder on each of them, and also the wires you'll be connecting to as well. As you can see, I'm working on my template, and the reason for that is some of the wiring we're going to have to do inside the electronics cavity of the guitar itself, as you can see here. But for the wires that I can connect outside of the guitar, I'd prefer to work outside of the guitar. And then I've put some low-tack tape just around this electronics cavity, just to give it a little more protection. Next thing I've done is go through and tin all the individual lugs. There's just a small amount of solder coating there, and that just helps us bond. Now, one of the first jobs we need to do is ground out this volume pot. So the easiest way to do that is to force the lug back onto the shielding. I've bent that pot back, just apply some heat, that heat for a few seconds, and just push my solder onto, and it shouldn't take much, as I said. So the next thing we need to do is install our capacitor. And as I said before, our capacitor is essentially a filter. So any current we direct through it, it will filter out specific frequencies and send those to ground. So what we need to do with this is through the output lug, and it also needs to be grounded to the back of the potentiometer. Okay, so we're connected to the input lug now in our tone pot. Next thing we want to do is just ground that to the back of the pot. So I'll just move that over to the side. I'm just going to apply some heat now to the back of that pot. Feed some solder in like so. Okay, so from there, that's our volume pot grounded and our capacitor installed on our tone pot. You can see this is where the input jack goes. We're going to need to run an earth wire from the electronics cavity out into the output jack. So I'm going to give myself plenty of wire to work with here. As I said, I'm using black here just for all earth wires, just so I have a color reference. I'm just going to feed that through. As I said, I've used plenty of wire here so I can trim that up at the end. I'll just leave that sit for now, or I can simply tape that off. It's a good idea sometimes just tape these wires off so they don't come back through. The way to thread that is definitely from the inside. You can't really get it from the outside. The hole on the outside of the guitar is bigger than the hole in the internal or the inside of the electronics cavity. I'm just going to tin my iron again, and then from there I'm just going to tin that wire as well. That's pretty much all we're trying to do. Okay, so this is our ground wire, and this is going to be going to the lug that's attached to the inner sleeve of the input jack. This section here of the input jack connects to the base of the guitar cable. So I'll just thread that through like so, push that back on itself. And from here I'll apply some heat to that lug and just push a small amount of solder on. And that's really all there is to that joint. Give it a little tug just to make sure that joint's good and strong. Now I also want to connect our two potentiometers. So I'll be connecting a ground wire between those also. And as you can see, the holes are located on the guitar itself. We don't need to make these terribly long. Roughly measure that out with the guitar, cut a section. Tin this wire as well. Here, all we're really trying to do is join the backs of our two pots together. You can see the pot wasn't hot enough then when I was first trying to lift the iron up. Okay, so from here, same thing. Give it a few seconds to heat up and push some solder into place. So next we're going to need to get our ground wire from the bridge onto this tone pot, which is going to be a little bit tricky because our wires are fairly short. So I'm hoping you can see that on camera. Tin that wire, I'll just tin my iron again as well. Quickly tin that wire, obviously taking care, working this close to the finish of the guitar. Now I'm going to want to ground that to the back of that pot. One of the next things we need to do is also run a ground wire from our ground lug on the back of our pickup selector, which you can see is connected to the casing, just that nearest volume pot. So again, I'm just going to cut a section long enough. I'll thread that through the eyelet of the ground lug. Quickly complete that joint. So again, just applying heat to the lug, warming it up first, a little unstable the base here, and just getting a bit of solder on that joint. From here, I'm just going to connect that to our volume pot. So if you're watching fairly carefully before, you notice I made a slight error, hadn't pulled this wire through properly on the input jack. So I've actually wired this inside the guitar, not how we wanted it. Okay, so now I'm going to put the controls inside the guitar. From here we're going to need to complete the remainder of the wiring. Actually, I may be able to get those bridge wires in place from here, which I'll do if I can. Okay, so our next step is to connect this active wire from the bridge pickup to the bridge position, on our pickup selector. So the downward position will be for our bridge, the up position will be our neck, middle position will be a blend. So I'm going to, hopefully this will reach, I'm going to connect this red wire here. As we know, the black wire coming from our guitar is the bridge. So I'm just going to connect that to the lug that's in the downward position. Thread that through the hole, which is often easier said than done. As mentioned, I often use a magnifying light, which can be very handy. Spin that back around. And again, I'll just apply some heat. Good firm joint as well. Now I want to earth that bridge pickup to the volume also. And that's fine. So from here, I'm going to put the controls in the guitar and we'll complete the wiring from inside the electronics cavity. Okay, as you can see, I've got the guitar turned over now. I'm quickly just going to tighten those controls in place. So I've connected the wire to that first lug, and I'm just going to come along now with my iron, heat up that lug, being very careful to avoid the guitar finish. Once it's had a few seconds, I'll just drop some solder onto that. Okay, so the next wire we need to connect is the earth off our pickup. Onto our volume pod. As you can see, it's going to be a little bit of a tight fit. We're going to need to be very careful of our other wires. This is where a chisel-nosed soldering iron can be useful. Okay, so our final part of the wiring process is to take our input from our pickup selector into the input of our volume and out to the middle lug of our tone. So I'm using white wires here just so I can differentiate between them, but I'm essentially coming from the output, which is the middle lug of the pickup selector. I've already soldered that one in place. I've connected two wires here on the right edge lug, which is the input of the volume, and that's coming straight out into the middle lug of the tone, which I've already soldered in place also. From here, I'm just going to heat that lug, drop some solder into place. We'll just test that joint. So we've got one last wire to connect, and that will be from the output of our volume to the output jack. So I'm going to just run that wire through the guitar first. Okay, so I've got that wire connected back to that lug. Just going to hold the iron on there for a second to apply some heat to both the wire and the lug itself, and slowly feed some solder onto that joint. Test the joint, that's fine. And finally, we just need to connect, I'll just pull this back toward the camera. And finally, we just need to connect this last white wire that we've just connected to the live lug on the output jack to the middle lug on our volume. I've already put some solder on that lug just so I didn't have to feed solder on. In this instance, just because it's a little bit finicky to get to, I'm hoping that's going to help us out. push these controls back in to their respective holes. Tart cable to go into the input, and we'll turn the amp on. What you're hearing straight away is hum. So we know you can't really hear over that hum. So what that hum's indicating is our ground circuit's not complete. So I'm suspecting once we turn over this guitar, there'll be a wire we've forgotten to install, or a wire that's come loose. So we'll just see. Of course, it's the wire off the input jack. So because we've already got a lot of ground wires going to the volume pot, I'm going to put this one to the tone pot. I think you'll find as soon as we do that, our noise will disappear.